to build such a mini black hole, you'd probably need crystals, because crystals appropriately cut and appropriately resonated would be the perfect material to make that link, since crystals molecules, first of all, crystals are 70% water, and then the crystal molecules are actually tetrahedral. The crystal molecules are very coherent if you have good crystals, and if they were cut in the appropriate geometry of the 64 tetrahedron grid with the right gases involved, you could create those dynamics. Because of my studies of the sun gods, you know, and because of my studies about the dynamic of ancient civilization, I had a really strong feeling that those crystals, and I'm going to tell you what it looks like right now. It's 64 tetrahedron grid inside a crystal ball. They're very small tetrahedron, they're inside a crystal ball, and there's gases inside that ball. Okay? This is not some esoteric New Age crystal. Okay? This is highly technical, technological stuff. Okay? It's not like a raw crystal you grab from a mountain and start meditating with. Okay? Now, when I believe that many of the New Age people remember the powers of the crystals because they remember that technology. Okay? The first person that talked about Atlantis was not some psychic. The first person that talked about Atlantis was Plato. Plato is and was extremely respected. And we used most of Plato's stuff except the 3 books that he wrote about Atlantis. And when he wrote these books, in all of them he mentions that this is not some story, this is factual. And he says he got it from the high priest in Egypt. And he describes a very advanced civilization that has a source of power, which is later as well described by Edgar Cayce, has a source of power that they call a crystal of extreme luminosity, of extreme power. I believe that is the crystal that can be built, the crystal of Atlantis, to create a link to the geometry of space. Do you guys all follow this? I was starting to read the Bible, and I was finding these plates of the description of God, and with it came words like the throne of God was the crystal seat, da 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 da. Many references to crystal. Ezekiel in the Bible, the story of Ezekiel. Enoch, which is not a book of the Bible. The book of Enoch was found in Ethiopia. Was never re-edited. It's translated directly from the original text. In both these accounts, they describe some kind of ship that shows up in a big cloud. And then they say a door opened and God called me onto his boat. And then inside it describes it describes the throne of God as crystals with rainbows all around it. You see? I think he was describing the power, the drive of that ship. So I was really intrigued. So I started to read the Bible, and as I read the Bible, I realized something. I realized something I had never noticed before. That is, that most of the Bible is describing the Old Testament is describing I'm going to have to read, and I can't hold this while I'm reading. Thank you. Appreciate it. So that the Bible actually is describing something, the Old Testament anyway, is describing something that is very, very strange. When the Old Testament talks about God, it doesn't say, and God. It says, and the Ark of the Covenant of God. It turns out that the whole Old Testament is describing the comings and going of the Ark of the Covenant, except for Genesis, which describes the start. But you see, even when you read Genesis in the context of what we saw today, you find that actually it's describing something very similar to the account of Atlantis given by Plato. A civilization that develops with a very advanced technology and that allows them to live very, very long. In the Bible, there's chapters after chapters describing people living 600 and 800 years. Okay? And then eventually that society was flooded, which is what Plato said happened to Atlantis. So actually Genesis could be an account of Atlantis. I thought that was interesting. And so I started to study it more and more. And I realized that the temples of Solomon was built for only one purpose: to host the Ark of the Covenant of God at its center, the Holy of Holy, the power of all power, the Ark. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. I didn't think that the Judaic tradition was about some object that they called the seat of God. So I was looking into it, and I was reading, and I thought, well, that's interesting, because in Genesis, it talks about the tree of knowledge. You know, Adam and Eve, and the tree of knowledge, and the apple, and so on. Well, interestingly, if you cut an apple in half, you get a double torus with a seed in the middle, which contains the possibility for a whole other apple tree, right? The singularity, which has apples and singularities and apples and singularities and so on. So I was reading that, and then I realized as well, this text, when this is in Genesis, it's 4:24. When men began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, plural, sons of God, saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married them, any of them, and they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. That means they were not from the earth. Okay? And also afterwards. And the sons of God went to the daughter of man and had children with them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. So, this describes the sons of God that came to the earth, so they were not from the earth, and had children with the women of the earth. I started to realize, wait a minute, was this planetary system seeded? You know, it started to, in anthropology, we're missing a huge link between the ancient Neanderthal and so on, and the modern Homo sapien. And that link we're missing is getting wider and wider, more and more records we get. There's new skulls that have been discovered now that makes that link even harder to make. So I started to think about it, and I'm like, that's interesting. And so I continued to read, and then I got across something really that perked my ears. It was in crossing of the sea. Exodus, that's 13:22. By day the Lord went ahead of them